Hey, everybody, it's a Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano, and I am so happy to be here with you today. So you have heard me say on this show many times before, plant-based is no longer enough. You cannot just stick up a blurb on the front of your package that says plant-based and hope to get an entire consumer group to purchase your product. In fact, what are the consumers looking for now as we go into this very diversified, very complex, I'll say, flexitarian or aspirational eater? Let's find out. I'm bringing in today, it's a topic I've been wanting to have for a very long time. I have consumer market research expert Shay Green here. He's the co-founder of Moonshot Collaborative. Shay, thanks for being with me.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Okay, so please, if you will, let's dive into it because I have so many questions for you. Let's just, if you would, for the audience, one sentence about your history in consumer research, and then we'll go right into why did you start Moonshot Collaborative? And for the record, tell everybody what it is.
Sure, great. And thanks again for having me. I've been studying consumer behavior and attitudes around plant-based eating, vegan eating for about 25 years now, mostly through the nonprofit sector and doing social science research around that topic, but also serving some of the for-profit companies as well. And I've been doing that through an organization called Funalytics, which I founded in the year 2000 and have now handed off the reins of leadership to another team, although I remain on the board of directors. With Moonshot Collaborative, we're taking sort of the same set of tools and turning them toward the for-profit space and really trying to help both plant-based alternative protein companies really and sustainable companies sort of get the insights that they need to reach their consumers. And my business partner, David Benzikin, who I believe you know, he and I started Moonshot Collaborative, the boutique research agency, to really bridge that gap between where plant-based and other protein companies are right now and the insights they need to be successful in the marketplace. We're very much a mission-driven company, like many of those in this space. And with our roughly 40 years or so of operating and researching in this space, we really feel like we have a lot of value to bring. And then one more point about Moonshot is that one of our unique selling points is that we have this existing panel of plant-based consumers, several thousand people who have been pre-identified and very deeply profiled so that we can make that research and that consumer base affordable and accessible to companies in this space that we're operating.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you for that. What I see here is that this is such a desperately needed tool in the marketplace because from where I sit with my company, Plant Powered Consulting, brands spend so much time getting the product ready for market. They know they need packaging. They know they need a great name. And they know they need distribution, but they've completely forgotten about talking with the consumer. And they just consider that because they love their product, and maybe it was a product that they couldn't find themselves, and that's why they perhaps created it in their kitchen, which is a story you hear a lot. They just assume that everybody wants that product. And although they may, it doesn't mean that you know how to speak to them, how to reach them, what's meaningful and valuable to them. So there's just a complete miss on the consumer research front. And as we go beyond the plant-based consumer, you're really getting to this, well, I'm kind of a meat eater, but maybe I shouldn't be. Therefore, I'll aspirationally, I'd like to be plant-based, but I'm not there. I mean, how do you talk to that person if you don't know them? And you really don't if you're a vegan in your kitchen making a product. So with this perspective, I see that Moonshot Collaborative is so desperately needed, consumer research in general. And I'm wondering from where you sit, what are the classic mistakes you see that brands make when they either try to do consumer research or they just forget it altogether? What are you seeing out there?
Sure. I think you alluded to it already. One of the biggest mistakes is just forgetting to use research. And that, obviously I'm biased. I do research. I would love for people to be doing more research, but you should use research judiciously, right? You should use it at the key decision points for your company, whatever that may be and whatever stage you're at. And so you want to use it for particularly any expensive decisions. So for instance, if you're going into tooling for a new product, or if you're choosing your co-manufacturer and you haven't really nailed down your product development with some consumer feedback, that's a point where you should probably invest, for instance. And so we see not enough research out there, but then we also see that sort of shooting from the hip, whether it's doing no research at all and just trusting one's gut, or it's asking maybe one's friends and family. And I don't know about you, but if I asked my friends and family about a new product concept that I had developed, they would say that they probably loved it. And I'm not sure that I can entirely trust that feedback. And so what we need to do is get outside of our little bubbles, if you will, as new entrepreneurs, as startup companies, even as more established companies, and really get the mindset of the consumer and feed that into our processes. And it's not a one and done, do a consumer survey and you're golden. Oftentimes it needs to be an iterative process to help you get from product development up to the messaging and advertising development that you're going to use to roll out. And then once you get sort of more entrenched, you're looking at brand tracking, competitive tracking, and things like that. So the nature of research changes a bit over time, but companies should be using it at all of those sort of key decision points rather than shooting from the hip.
Okay, so let's unpack that for a little bit. So this is what I see all the time. Brands just shooting from the hip, and they assume that, well, their gut reaction, they're so in tune to their own brand, of course, that they've nailed it. And that's usually a miss. But I see the other side of the coin as well. What you've just described takes time. And, we're seeing the plant-based landscape change almost daily. David and I were joking the other day, like, oh, forget predictions. Because we used to say, I started the show, used to say predictions for 10 years, and then it was 5 years, and then it was 3 years. And now it's like by the week because things are changing so quickly. So I understand that brands might not want to spend the time, might not want to spend the budget. You're talking about a lot of tests there. You were talking about, changing how you do consumer research over time and testing at every stage. It's a lot. So maybe you could guide us through the key market research that you need early on that you cannot shoot from the hip for.
Sure. And it will be, I should say, I'll talk in generalities, but it will vary quite a bit, of course, by particular companies or products. But I would say at the early stage anyway, like if you're at the concept stage, for instance, getting some sort of consumer feedback on how much your concept resonates, not just with consumers in general, but with specific cohorts of consumers. And that's one of the things that we do at Moonshot. So you want to, get a sense of the overall, how many adults, for instance, would buy your product over the next month or 3 months if it were available. But then you want to look at those breakdowns because just like, marketing dollars are limited and you're not going to be able to reach everybody. And so where do you start? Do you start with the low hanging fruit? Do you start with those who have maybe already purchased a competing product or a conventional version of your product? And there are various ways to look at that. So I would say, first off, start by validating your concept and not just thinking that it's a wonderful idea. Maybe you get some friends and family feedback. Try to validate that. And we can talk about some relatively cost-effective ways that you can do that. But go beyond just that top line number and look at how it differs for different segments, male and female and different age groups, of course, but beyond that too. And so it looks at head of households, those who have children in the home. There's different variables that you can look at to really hone in on a target market, which is especially critical for startup companies that just don't have the advertising dollars to sort of blanket the market.
Well, that's the thing. You might not have the budget for this kind of thing. So what kind of budget are we talking about?
Again, it depends a bit. And we actually have a blog on moonshotcollaborative.com that talks about costs for different things. If you're doing a survey, if you're doing, at Moonshot Collaborative, again, we have this proprietary panel. We run monthly surveys where we share client questions. Of course, they're all proprietary to each client, but that's $1,000, $250. So it's $1,250, and you can get a concept test for your product. And so that's sort of the low end. If you're doing a custom study with us, it probably starts at around 5,000. I would say, though, if you go to a Kantar or a much larger company, you pay 3 or 4x what our prices usually are. And so for quantitative research, I would tend to suggest, starting budget of around $5,000. If you're doing interviews and focus groups, which is qualitative research, it depends on how many you're doing, but you can do at least a startup project for around that same amount. But I would say, to your point, is that although we recommend doing research at all the key stages, that doesn't always have to be big and horrendously expensive types of research. And I think that there are some sort of smaller scale efforts that very young companies or very budget-strapped companies can take. And, for instance, many people have heard of A/B split testing. And so you can do that, which is basically a miniature experiment to see which of two concepts or 3 or 4 concepts potentially resonates the most, and then you sort of choose the winner based on that. So many people are familiar with that concept. There's more robust versions of experiments that you can do like that. The challenge is that you can often have that skill set even in-house, or you can sort of wing it. But the problem is getting access to an external audience, because you can use those methods, and if you're still asking your friends and family, you're getting the wrong feedback. And so what you usually pay for with research is access to an external audience to give you feedback, whether that's quantitative or qualitative. And that's where our companies should be really focused on making their investments.
So when I hear you speak, I hear you talk about what I would say a corporate company coming in and saying, I've got 3 or 4 concepts, which one will fly? I know I want to be in the plant-based space. Whereas the plant-based entrepreneur usually says, I am passionate about this one concept. I don't have 3 or 4 that I'm going to test. I'm going with this one thing because I love it. The market needs it. It should happen. And there's that huge passion play there. And I always say that that's, quoting Seth Tibbett here, the founder of Tofurky, that is the plant-based person's superhero power weapon, So I wouldn't want to say put your passion under the table. I'm not saying that at all. But usually the passionate person just blows right by everything you're talking about because they've got passion on their side.
It's
so,
true.
It's a little bit of a detriment here in this case. When you talk about concept research in the beginning, how big might that audience be that you tested on?
If I'm understanding correctly, do you mean the sample size for the research?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, so we recommend generally no fewer than 400 to 500 people for a concept test. And again, you want that to sort of be reflective of the broader target audience that you're seeking. One thing we see sometimes, and I get a lot of people who are interested in serving the millennial audience. We're all about millennials right now in the plant-based sector. And so the question then is, why do you want to survey the millennial audience? And it's usually because of just generic findings that millennials are driving the space. And that's partly true, but you don't want to go into it with presuming that you're just focused on millennials. And so you want to start more broadly and verify that, in fact, millennials, and see what other constituencies are also resonating with your product concept. And so just going back to what you said a moment ago, very much get the passion. I talk to, several very passionate startup founders every week. But I don't want to sort of erode any of that passion, but I want to validate that passion and help them be successful, because that passion can fade if you have too many failures or too much lack of traction as you hit the market.
Yes, most definitely. Although some things like passion won't get you everywhere, as you're aptly saying. I mean, you need some research numbers. I'm always amazed. Oh, we're having an earthquake here in California. Did you feel that?
I'm in Washington State, so
okay, well,
are you safe?
It's over.
Okay.
Everybody, we've been through an earthquake together. That was fun. I wondered why my desk was shaking like that. Okay, well, we live to tell, so I'll move on. I'm always amazed at how people skip right through the taste test part. So there's the concept, there's so many things we could test, right? There's concept, there's messaging, promotional and or nutritional, and probably more. There's price. But then there's the general taste of it. And without naming any names here, I recently tried something and I was like, no, you didn't go to market with this. It's not possible. And so then I had other people taste it because I was so gobsmacked. Nobody liked it. But anyways, I don't know. So if you could give us a list of all the things that one could test early on. I think you were kind enough to say, well, it's really concept first, so make sure you get that. But again, passionate people blow right through concept. They just love their concept. They move right to product. Tell us some of the things that we should be checking on.
Yeah, and so when you're doing product development, I mean, typically what you're doing, assuming you can get the product in the hands of the folks that you're testing it with, you're doing sensory testing. So it's taste, of course, but you're also doing how does it appeal in terms of look? How does it smell? And then you go through a series of what would you do with this product? How do you cook with it? And then overall, sort of what is their feedback? And then you can look at that because there's industry standards like the hedonic scales. It's a 9-point scale that's reused as sort of an industry standard for doing sensory testing and overall product likability, if you will. And then you can use some industry benchmarks for that. And so I completely agree with you. A lot of people have blown past the concept stage. They're cooking up these products in their kitchen and they're starting develop packaging and messaging, etc., interrupting that process just briefly. And you can do this. Ideally, you would do this quantitatively with a larger sample size, but you can do it with smaller sample sizes. And right now, during the middle of a pandemic, it's a little bit more challenging to do actual taste testing. But one of the things we're doing at Moonshot, and we're actually working with 2 companies to develop this right now, is actually doing in-home taste testing, where we're sending out refrigerated or shelf-stable products to members of our panel, and asking them to go through that sensory testing and give us their overall feedback on the product. So we're finding ways around the pandemic and in-store sampling and all of the limitations that are happening right now to do exactly what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Without calling out any names, I gave you an example of one product that I was like, oh, testing would have been helpful here. Have you had any experiences of course, without any names of
Sure.
Just to give people an understanding of like, whoops, when you can miss really big, and why you might not want to skip this step or this budget line?
Yeah, I mean, I have 1 or 2 examples, but they would be pretty obvious who I'm talking about.
Don't do that.
Yeah, I know, I don't want to do that. But I will say that, a lot, I feel like, and this is just my feeling, I don't have a lot to back this up, but I feel like a lot of the original, the OG alt meat companies that have been around for 25 or 30 years, I feel like they could have headed off, this transition a little bit earlier with some either better or just any research at all, and specifically around product development, because I feel like there was an inherent upper limit with frozen patties and the form factors that we were in before. And you come, with Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, we sort of interrupted all of that. And I feel like, some of those companies, again, without naming names, could have done more innovative product development research earlier on, and could have also figured out ways to expand the consumer base beyond vegans, vegetarians, and health conscious consumers, which is where we were for a long time. And now we're moving much more mainstream with flexitarians. And I feel like that could have happened a bit sooner with better research.
Isn't that interesting? So it's what comes first, the vegan chicken or the vegan egg? I mean, when I think of this, I think of the market giving us this tsunami push forward, and that not much could have been done until the market got on our side, only reinforced by COVID. But you're saying the opposite, that actually had some of these major brands gotten with the program a little bit earlier in terms of consumer research and maybe identifying flexitarians earlier on, that the market as a whole would have grown faster. Am I understanding that right?
You are, and I definitely believe that that's the case.
Really?
Yes, because the market, it's both. It's a combination of internal and external factors, right? The external factors being health, being the environment, being animals, and these pressures that cause us to eat more plant-based products. Those were always there, and those aren't changing. What could have happened earlier was better tasting products and arguably more affordable products. And so I feel like we could have gotten there a bit sooner, and it would have been that from the product development side, not so much the changing landscape side.
But isn't price just a function of scale? So how much can consumer research really?
It's mostly a function of scale, sure.
Yes,
but it's also, it's also partly other factors like what you put in the products, et cetera, of course.
Yes,
but I would say it's not, we could, again, have scaled sooner had the products been better. And again, I'm not, it takes time to develop a Beyond Burger. I understand that for sure. But there's a big gap between, again, I don't want to name any names, but a Morningstar, frozen patty from 30 years ago, right. I feel like we could have done more to bridge that gap in between. Again, just my opinion, not based on a whole lot of factor research.
Oh, your opinion counts. Come on now. Okay, well, what do you think about this? Because the market is so on fire for plant-based products, could one make the argument that now you don't really need to do research because whatever plant-based product goes to shelf, it's going to hit big? Is that accurate, or would you say no to that?
I would say no to that. I don't have the stats on all the, what products make it to market versus those that fail. But first off, I think the dynamic is generally wrong if people make that assumption. But secondly, there is no shortage of new alt protein products entering the market. Even pick a particular category and you may have dozens of new entrants, just this year. So it's crazy. And research is in many ways a competitive advantage and a differentiator. You use it to figure out what's best about your product, what resonates most with consumers, and then you also use it to figure out how to convey that that sets you apart from your competitors and gains you traction with consumers. And so I feel like research has a role to play in all of that.
Well, I feel that this tailwind we're getting coming from the growing flexitarian market is a tailwind. So that's wonderful, but it makes the market much more complex. So just like I said when we started this show, and like I say all the time, and why my business at Plant Power Consulting is going through the roof, it's because plant-based is no longer enough. You just can't be plant-based and hope for any sense of differentiation or any sort of real loyal relationship with your consumer base. I mean, are they plant-based because they're older and they're worried about their health? Are they plant-based because they're younger and they're taking sort of a political stand, if you will? Are they plant-based because it's animal rights? Are they plant-based for the environment, et cetera, et cetera? I could go on and on. Are they plant-based just because they don't want to eat like their folks? Are they plant-based because they finally read labels? I mean, you don't know what's driving them. And so the market is growing, which is fantastic, but it's becoming a very dynamic and complicated world out there. And so the more research, the better. If you can take the time, well, you should take the time if you can find the budget. That's always the tricky thing.
Agreed.
So maybe if you could give us a sense for who is out there. So I've just listed a couple of them, but maybe you have probably some of the same list, but even more perhaps of what that flexitarian consumer could look like.
Sure. Yeah. And first off, your observations are exactly right. What is driving the market is very much that quote unquote flexitarian or part-time vegetarian, part-time plant-based person. What we found in our panel is comprised of people who have purchased plant-based foods, and that's meat or dairy products or eggs, in the 3 months prior to joining up the panel. What we found is that more than 9 out of 10 of people in our panel also purchased conventional meat, dairy, or egg products in the past 3 months. So that's your flexitarian consumer. And sure, we do find that they skew a little bit more, or it's more likely to be flexitarian and part-time vegetarian among millennials. We also see that among the Generation Z, which is very encouraging, even though that's based on a somewhat smaller sample size, which are roughly 2/3 women. That drive the plant-based buying in the sector. And vegans and vegetarians still, remain about, of the population, they're maybe 3 to 5% combined. And among plant-based buyers, they're roughly double that. So maybe 8 to 10% or so of plant-based buyers are vegans or vegetarians. So we see that still is a relatively small segment. But there's this wonderful quote from, it's actually an auto industry executive, I think it was 15 years or so ago, as they were talking, it was Toyota, I think, and they were talking about switching to non-leather seats in their cars.
Oh, yeah.
And they described vegans as the center of the bullseye. And the center of the bullseye is very small, right? But it's important. And I think that the vegans and vegetarians have somewhat of an outsized influence on the market relative to their proportion as a consumer base. And so I think you see companies that are aiming products at vegetarians or vegans, but really striving for a market that's bigger and several concentric circles out from that. And so I don't think, we have these different consumer profiles and different segments, but they really influence each other in different ways.
Okay. Are you seeing the aspirational flexitarian? And maybe I'm being kind. Maybe what I really want to say here is, are you seeing a lot of misreporting? I want to be flexitarian, so I'll call myself a flexitarian because I don't want to be the jerk that my dad's generation was. I'm being callous, as like a young kid might say, like, I don't want to be that generation, but I'm not really doing what I say I'm doing. Is that out there?
Sure, that's out there with any consumer research. Specifically around flexitarians, it's hard because everybody's using a different definition of what is a flexitarian, and so it's inherently murky. When you look at vegans and vegetarians, if you just ask self-reported, are you a vegan or vegetarian, you're going to get roughly double the proportion of people that are truly eating a vegan or vegetarian diet. And that's where I talk about the aspirational nature of it.
So that's tricky. What do you do if the results come back that it's, 100% more than it actually is? Walk me through that, because that could really send a brand awry.
Well, if you're looking at specifically vegan, vegetarian, you don't ask them just, are you vegan or vegetarian? You would do something called a food frequency questionnaire where you obfuscate sort of the veganness of it and ask them what kinds of foods they've eaten over a certain period of time. And then you can sort of tease vegan and vegetarian out of that. So you try to get away from that self-identification thing, which is where the aspirational component comes in. And you can do that same sort of thing for flexitarian. So for instance, one of the things that we do at Moonshot is we ask it several different ways. We ask which of a series of products have they purchased over the past 3 months. We also ask what proportion of their diet is plant-based. And then we also ask, like, based on number of meals. And then we also ask for their self-identified, are you flexitarian, vegan, vegetarian, what have you. And so you sort of can triangulate on it that way. But it's really better to not just ask somebody directly to self-identify as something. It's better to sort of get around that through a different way and through less obvious means, if that makes sense.
It does. How vegan is your rainbow? Basically, you gotta figure this out. And I would love to see. I joke a little bit, but I would love to see, like, if you think you're flexitarian because you are buying Beyond Meat or Impossible, that is not enough. Like, a real flexitarian has at least one other brand in their refrigerator, so it shows that they're not buying something because it's the thing that's cool at the moment that everyone says you should try, but they're actually, for whatever reason, animal, environment, their own health, they're trying to find more brands that fit into their lifestyle that work for them on a continuous basis. Because I worry that so much of the Beyond Meat and the Impossible is like, oh, I want to be one of the ones who tried it, and then, whatever, now they're a flexitarian, but they've never tried it again or something. That will not fly.
The consumers, they don't care about the labels at all, right? That's inside baseball for us in the plant-based world that are thinking about flexitarians. They might self-identify as that on a survey, but they're not aspiring to become a flexitarian. And so for us, as whether it's advocates or entrepreneurs, our goal is just to keep moving them along the spectrum. Whatever the label is just keep moving them in that plant-based alt protein direction.
I have to say, I'm a little surprised by that. And maybe I'm just inside my bubble, inside the earthquake bubble here in Los Angeles. But I sort of thought like flexitarian was like a veggie cool kind of name, no? Maybe just with me.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I tend to think of that as more of an inside thing. Even vegan and vegetarian, again, the labels are somewhat murky. As we all know, some vegetarians eat chicken and fish and still consider themselves vegetarian. And so I tend to think of labels as being more of an us thing. Those of us who really study the industry, study the market, tend to think about categories and labels, whereas consumers are just trying to eat a little bit healthier. Maybe swap out a product here and there. Yeah.
Yes, of course, you're so right. The world is a very busy place, and most people don't put as much thought into it as we are doing right now, and as ideally the brands would do. So, we talked a little bit about budget, and not everybody has a budget, although I would caution everyone against this for the same reason that I caution them against not having a marketing budget. I know it's common for brands to spend a lot of time on R&D and getting packaging and a brand name and distribution and working out the product kinks and shipping, et cetera. But if you don't have a marketing budget, then you are not going to be able to differentiate yourself from the other gazillion plant-based products out there now. And there are so many, and I know of more coming to the market, and I'm sure you do as well, Shay. So part of that marketing budget is marketing research. But if you don't have a big marketing research budget, can you give people some tips on how they might do some of their own? It's not going to be your mom. It's not going to be your best friend. But beyond that, who else should they talk to? What else can they do on their own?
Well, you might want to talk to your mom's best friend.
Okay.
So if you can get one step removed from your bubble, that's helpful. You know what I mean? So it's not asking your friends for their opinion, but it's asking your friends to send out a survey to their friends. You know what I mean? It's far from perfect, and it's not the one I would normally recommend, because this is just if you have no budget. And so doing a survey or even a series of interviews with people that are removed and that are certainly not heavy plant-based eaters. You want to get to presumably one's target audience is going to include flexitarians and meat eaters, and if that's the case, then you certainly want those folks included in your sample for any research or testing you're doing as well. But let me back up, because the mother's best friend was just sort of a quip. I think that you can do a lot of desk research, especially these days when you've got organizations like Plant-Based Food Association, GFI, producing a lot of really useful information. You may not have to reinvent the wheel. Now, most of that's going to be at a generic, category level.
Sure.
So what's the growth of plant-based cheese over the past 3 years? And that's useful, especially useful, for instance, if you're building a pitch deck, and trying to seek investments. But if you're looking at a specific concept that you're wanting to roll out, chances are you can triangulate and get some sense of how successful that would be based on desk research and what's out there. But most likely you're going to have to do some sort of primary research, even if it is, the equivalent of your mom's best friend and getting that kind of information. The other one I would say is that, what I mentioned earlier is that when you're doing research, what you pay for is, generally speaking, access to people providing the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can get around that to some extent, or at least reduce the costs of that to some extent, by focusing a little bit more on qualitative research. We tend to think about quantitative research and doing big surveys and making sure we have statistically significant results and all of that. But you can get a lot of, especially at the product development, concept development stage, you can get a lot of really rich information from just doing 10 or 15 interviews with people, or a couple of small focus groups, if that's what I generally don't prefer focus groups myself, but you can get that kind of feedback, and you can do it very much on the cheap. It might not be free. You might want to pay for a plant-based charcuterie platter for your interviewees, but you can do it less expensive. For sure.
So much to unpack there. First of all, if you were doing something, your mother's best friends, how many best friends does your mother need to have? So how big does this budget, non-budgeted focus group that is your mother's friends need to be for it to be useful?
Again, if we're talking quantitative research, we recommend being in the 400 to 500 person range, preferably higher than that. If you're doing qualitative research, it can be much smaller, because you're not taking the results and sort of thinking about them as reflective of an overall population. With qualitative, you could probably do 20 or 30 interviews and at that point, you start to saturate sort of the themes that you're getting in terms of feedback.
So I'll take that one step further. I see your could do 20 to 30. And I raise you must do 20 to 30. If you're a brand and you have not talked to 20 to 30 people about what they think about your product, you go back and sit on the couch and watch TV, because it's not going to work, right? If you can't put in the hours to talk to 30 potential customers, then that's not going to fly. And what I see a lot is I'd love to see more research done on plant-based cheeses before they come to market, because cheese is such a finicky thing. It means something different to everyone. And there's that childhood memory, and everyone has a different one that they're trying to tap into when they taste melted cheese. And I think a lot of plant-based brands have missed that. Of course, we're all trying to crack the code for cheese. So I can see where this kind of qualitative research could be so helpful. And I go back to my days at the Kellogg Corporation, which is where I started my career in brand management. I had Special K and Frosted Mini Wheats as my brands. And unlike you, I used to love doing focus groups. So we would pull in particular Special K, which was such a personal identification for the consumer. They really saw themselves as like a best friend to the brand. And it was a girlfriend that they had, Special K being a diet cereal. And for some people, it's what they ate every morning for breakfast for decades. It's what they thought kept them in shape. Of course, that's not accurate, because it's just Rice Krispies and Special K are the same product, just one is flat. So there's nothing really special about that brand except marketing. They honed in that people really wanted to connect in a diet way to their brand. And so that was how Special K was born. But I remember, and this comment came from a prison warden, focus group of all women. And we were talking to people about what the brand meant to them and what they, felt every morning. And this prison warden said, I feel like this is my little black dress. For the women out there, you might know, like, a little black dress is like that one outfit you can count on every Friday. You slip into it, you look fantastic. Your Friday's ready to roll. The weekend has come around. You have your reliable, classic, never goes out of style. Maybe had it for 10 years because it never goes out of style, little black dress. And that's how she explained Special K. And from that, we did a very long advertising campaign about the little black dress that you slip into. You've got your Special K every morning and your little black dress at night. Anyways, the focus groups I found to be incredibly informative. And you are saying you're not a fan of them. I'm surprised.
I should clarify. Yeah. So I've personally moderated probably 80 different focus groups. I've sat in the green room for another 50 or 60. So I am actually a believer in focus groups. But there's a big qualification for that. If you are operating on a small budget, which is the factor or is the case for the vast majority of the companies we're talking to in this space, focus groups can be cost prohibitive. And that's because the scheduling is very difficult. The getting everybody in a room together, you can have one person in a focus group that just tanks the whole thing and derails the research effort. And so with focus groups, you don't want to do any fewer than 2, and you tend to want to do 3 or 4 with every different individual constituency because you want some homogeneity in the group. So that's all challenging and can be quite expensive because you're also compensating every individual. In my experience, we can get pretty much just as good of information with individual interviews, and it's much less costly and more easy to schedule and all of that. There are a few instances where group dynamics are a factor and you want to see how sort of people bounce ideas off each other more. That's certainly very relevant. And then what we do oftentimes is small group interviews where we're doing it with like 3 or 4 family members or 3 or 4 people who know each other and might have some sort of social connection. And so there are sort of versions of focus groups that we strongly recommend doing. And if you have the budget, I agree, focus groups can be useful, but for most people, they're pretty expensive.
Yeah, no, that was a Kellogg type of
Kellogg
budget. So that's
yeah.
that's really a marketing company. They've got the dollars and see the value here. But I like what you're saying about versions of focus groups. So that concept of people who know each other, 3 or 4 of them, and you do maybe 8 to 10 of those. You can find 40 people in your world or your friend's world or your friend's friend's world, and you can talk to them and see what they think about your product. I think that's really just a great idea. Now, what about everybody has a website? So that's, a no budget kind of thing. What about doing a questionnaire, quick survey on the website, those kind of easy, no budget things? Do you suggest those for startups?
It doesn't hurt as long as you view the results in appropriate context. So in the absence of any other research, I would say, yes, do that. But in that survey, be sure to include some profiling questions so that that folks should be included or excluded in your analysis. And if they're too close to you, if they're already hardcore vegans, maybe you might want to exclude them because they might not be representative of the audience you're trying to reach. And so I would allow yourself to segment those results. And so you really see sort of, are you getting a biased feedback from a subset that's then driving the overall survey results or not?
Yes. And I would say one of the mistakes that I see brands make in this category is they offer people free food for their response to the food. But then since they've just been given this free gift, they tend to say that they loved it. You can get very skewed results when you're giving free food and then the person eating that food knows that the results are going right back to you personally and you just gave them free food. They might not really tell you the truth. So I'd watch out for that.
Yeah, and the quality control is a constant thing in research, separating fact from fiction and real opinions from, what people think. That there's a social desirability bias is a common thing in research, for instance, which is what you're talking about. And so there are researchers' ways to get around that in order to analyze the results and sort of, excuse me, and to sort of take that out of the picture. So very conscious of that, and it's something that we deal with regularly.
It's like picking a jury.
Kind of, yeah.
It's really kind of amazing. Okay, well, if people were doing surveys on their own website, a couple top 3 questions. I mean, don't give away everything. Obviously, if you've learned anything from this interview, it's that you should reach out to Shay. But if you like the top 3 questions, like don't miss this question on your own survey, folks.
Again, I'm sorry to qualify it, but it depends on what stage that company is at. So if you're at the concept stage, you want to get feedback on the concept. It's whatever decision or information you need to move forward with the next major decision for the company, right? And so whether that's nailing down the concept and getting that validation of the thing that you just whipped together in your kitchen, that's one data point. If you're a little bit further along and you have an actual product, it's getting that sensory feedback. If you're in a position to be able to make adjustments, if you actually can adjust the salt content, then you'll ask about that. You only ask about what you can actually change, of course. If you're further along, again, you might want to, on your website survey, you might want to ask about competing brands. So what else do they buy over time? And so you get a sense of sort of who's in the basket with you, and who else are you trying to maybe emulate, or who else are they buying at least. So it just depends a little bit on what stage you're at and tailoring it to the needs of where you as a company or a product are going next.
And what you need to move forward.
Yeah.
Okay. We're not talking about the Kellogg's of the world or even the, let's say, Impossible Foods that have, I think, 500 billion raised. So far, obviously they've raised a lot of money. We're talking about the small startup. They do have a budget. Maybe they've gone through a seed round. They have a budget, but it's not going to be huge. How much would you suggest they put aside a year for market research?
Good question. It will depend a bit on the nature of the company. Let me actually use an industry benchmark, which is that there's, I think it was the WK Kellogg Foundation did a study a while back in terms of very effective organizations, and they included some companies in that as well. And the most effective organizations, they put a specific number to it, spent 7% of their annual budget on market research. So that's one benchmark, but it's obviously somewhat arbitrary. And so I would say as a percentage, you probably want to be, in that 5 to 10% of either your overall budget or at a minimum of your marketing budget should go to market research. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree. And I would say that market research should be, 20 to 25% of your overall marketing budget. So, because you got to execute and the creative behind it and stuff. So you guys all do the math there. You put that together for yourselves. But basically our common shared opinion here is that, you can't skip marketing. So I'm always like, when I work with my brands and they're getting for a raise, the last page of my deck is always remember to raise for marketing, because people often don't, which is just kind of funny.
It's an interesting assumption that we have such a great product that it will sell itself, but no, we need to actually sell it, and we need to know how to sell it with research.
And the thing is, we've all made that mistake, right? We've had this idea that we were just like, well, we see the value, so everybody else must think it's an ingenious idea as well. Yeah. But many a product have tanked for not doing research. Before I switch over to ask you a couple of exit questions on our way out, is there anything that you would like to add that you feel that would be really helpful? I know we've given a lot of tips and a lot of guidance and a lot of structure, but anything else that you would like to say for the person who is a first-time entrepreneur, they've got their product, they're about ready to do some marketing research? Any specific tips for them?
Yeah, just start small if needed, but start somewhere. Again, going back to your mother's best friend example, just do not rely exclusively on your own feedback or your partner's feedback or something along those lines. They're really, research is all about just getting outside of our own heads and getting feedback from those that we're eventually trying to reach, whether it's an advocacy message or a product or a service. And so as you roll the product out, make sure that you're baking in external feedback, whatever that looks like. Bake in that external feedback to your process at the product development phase, at the rollout phase, when you're an entrenched company. Think about it then as well. So, and that's comes from the fact that I know many companies are just not even considering research at these early stages, perhaps because they assume it's cost prohibitive, which for some of them it will be, but certainly not for all. And so again, with some of the low cost techniques we talked about earlier, start small if you have to, but certainly start somewhere. And it's not just for your own information. That certainly should be the main goal, but increasingly, and I know this for a fact from talking to many companies, increasingly investors are looking for data as part of pitch decks. They're looking for actually some hard numbers to validate your concept before throwing money. And those investors are getting a lot more opportunities to throw money around these days. And so in order to stand out and to really show that you've nailed down your concept, showing that validation, that research in your pitch deck, I think is incredibly important.
100%. But ultimately, you want to be the most educated person on your product on the planet. And market research really helps you be that. So to sort of do your brand proud, if you will, you really can't skip this step. I would like to add also two things. I hope this isn't blasphemous to you, Shay, but if you don't have a budget, something that can be very helpful here is an intern. So while I wouldn't leave the questioning or the survey to the intern, ultimately you really need to write that and spend some time with it. And, maybe even just hire Shay for an hour or two consulting. I don't even know if you do that, Shay. I don't know if you would help someone do the questions, but let's say that you could put those questions together. Then you can have that intern for the summer execute by finding people online online who might want to participate, sending out the questionnaire, getting it in, tallying the results. Obviously, you would need to read the results and put together the conclusions, but a summer intern or a 4-credit internship during the school year could be very helpful here. That's my one tip. And then my other tip is, of late, things come in waves, and of late, I have seen a slew of bad names. And I'm not sure how this can be, because when I think of a product, I sort of, because I've been an entrepreneur, several times over now, it's true, I didn't always test the concept. I just was so enamored. I figured, well, everyone's going to love it. It's so great. But I always tested the name, because the name is so random and it means different things to different people. And it's the first thing that people encounter even before they taste it or try it, or, you see the name. And of late, there's just been god awful names, but just like awful. So, I know you can't stop every time you do something in your company. Obviously, you have to move on and you have to move at a quick pace, but test as much as you can everywhere you can along the way, I guess.
No,
is what I would
naming
say.
is sort of important. What
It's
you name your
big.
company, what you name your product, has kind of an impact on how much it resonates with people. So that might be one of those points in time when you actually invest in research.
So you and I should have drinks, and we should just share like the bad brand stories, not to throw anyone under the bus, but just sort of like, the can't believe human nature missed this one kind of story. There
I
are
think
so
we
many
should,
of them.
at Moonshot, we should hire you to shame companies into doing research and working with us.
Oh dear. Oh dear. I'm up for the drinks for sure. The rest we'll see. Don't want to shame anybody, but you never know. These are fun conversations. Okay. Let me ask, because you and I didn't actually discuss this. Are you vegan?
I am.
You are. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe you could share with me, when was the moment you knew? So maybe you were already vegan, but it was a brand new experience or something. But when was the moment you could say in time, like a conversation happened or an experience happened, where you said, I will never go back to meat and dairy?
Yeah, that's a good question, because for me it was a little bit more of an evolution. I'll actually go back to when I became vegetarian. So I became vegan in 1997, and I was vegetarian for a couple of years prior to that. And I actually became vegetarian in Alaska while I was working for Trident Seafood Company. And so I
Thank
was
you.
working in their cannery,
Oh,
and I was just exposed to the
oh,
atrocity of
God
literally
almighty.
millions of fish being processed by that facility. And I went vegetarian actually while still working there, and it was cost prohibitive for me to fly back, and I was there, of course, to make money for college, and so I stuck it out for that summer and didn't do it again, of course. But that was my vegetarian aha moment anyway, and then I became vegan a couple of years later, once I realized that eggs and dairy were also quite horrific, and so that was my story, and that was my impetus. It was purely an ethical decision, not health motivated.
Mm-hmm. That's a great story. Of course, so timely with Seaspiracy out. And
Very much
if you
so.
get a chance, I have an interview with iconic pop rock star Richard Marx and his supermodel wife, Daisy Fuentes. And each of them, in an interview with me, share the moment they decided to stop eating fish. And it's incredible stories. I'll share it with you after this.
Please.
Um, Okay, so now sort of some more general questions. What predictions do you have? I just told you I wasn't going to ask any prediction questions. So what prediction do you have for the next week, or I'll say the next 3 years? Where do you see the market going from your specific vantage point?
All right, I'll stick with the 3 year. That's a little bit more feasible than the next week. Thinking of longer term trends. Honestly, I think it's more of the same. We are
Uh,
seeing such a rocket engine driving the alt protein space right now, and I
yeah.
don't see that changing. We just did a report on price parity and how consumers see price parity. And the reality is that most plant-based buyers are willing to pay a premium, but it's very small.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
those that are willing to pay a premium of more than like 10% is like a very small segment of the population. And so what we're seeing is that right now, of course, it's the people who are a little bit more able to buy plant-based proteins, or especially motivated to do so, like the vegans and vegetarians. As that pricing dynamic changes, the floodgates are going to open, and
Mhm.
plant-based, I think, products are just going to be so much more mainstream, have so much more mainstream appeal. And so I see the general trend already heading in that direction. I see the scaling and price parity just being, another match, if you will, to light the fire. And so I'm excited by what's happening. I think that taste is becoming, just even removing sort of cell-based from the discussion. In the plant-based world, taste is becoming a lot closer to the analogous product. Now, again, I say that as a longtime vegan who doesn't remember what a real hot dog tastes like, but I feel like we're getting really close. And so if you got the taste down, if you've got the price, which is coming, I can't see this trend slowing down anytime soon.
Yes, and I think you're going to see a big push from large corporations. They've got the ad budgets and the distribution channels, and they know that the resources aren't going to be there, like land, water, time. It's a very inefficient system, meat and dairy. It's wasteful of our resources. And, we're going from 7 billion people to 10 billion people on the planet, but you're not getting more land. And you're
all
not
those
getting more water.
external pressures I mentioned earlier aren't going away. They're only going to get worse. Yeah.
Yes, right. Exactly. Okay. Here's another sort of esoteric question for you as we wrap up. What do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now? And you can change that to be 5 years or 7 years or whatever you want. But what do you wish you knew a while back that you know now?
I wish I had known what was going to happen with the alt protein space, and I'm not saying I would have done anything differently necessarily. I'm very proud of the work that I did for social science research and advocacy. I think it's been important, but to see how much, we don't have to change attitudes if we just create really great products, and so seeing the impact that the business community has had, and maybe I could have been a part of that a little bit earlier than I have been and help propel that even faster. So I wish I had known that then, but again, not taking away at all from the social science work with Funalytics that I've been doing over the past 20 years.
Yes. I always like to say on this show, for me, the power of your own voice. So for a long time, I was, figuring out a way to be vegan, vegetarian, and I didn't really talk about it that much. And now I can't stop talking about it, obviously. So I just wish that I had found the strength of my own voice, which I had in every other dimension of my life, in my business, in my radio work, in my entrepreneurial work. And I had it for animals, but I wasn't able to really push back and say, like, no, you can't bully me into eating meat and dairy. It's just, I didn't push back in sort of the hockey hip check way I would today. So
that's a great lesson for people listening,
100%.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe you're having a bad day. Things don't go your way. You're not in a great mood, or it's been a bad business day. What is the phrase that you tell yourself to get yourself back in the game?
Thank you for sharing this question ahead of time. Otherwise, I would have struggled with that. The one I came up with, it's just a flesh wound from Monty Python, which is about, the perseverance in the face of adversity.
I love that scene. It's just a flesh wound. And it's the bunny that kills him, right?
The nasty pointy teeth. Yeah, I think so.
I haven't watched that movie in so long. I love them. Just a flesh wound. Oh, that is great. That is wonderful. Okay, you're super busy. You're running around. You don't have time for lunch. What's your favorite snack?
Favorite? I don't eat it all
snack.
the time. But I will say that, we garden. My wife and I do a lot of gardening, and we grew eggplants for the first time last summer. And I made the best baba ganoush I've ever had, and it was amazing. And so I'm really looking forward to making that again this year.
I've never considered growing eggplant. It's just not even on the realm of what's possible. Do you need a special? Because you're on the East Coast, pretty cold out there. It's something you grew in the
Northwest.
fall?
I'm Northwest.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And so we do, I grew mine in a greenhouse, but I did grow one outside as well. And it did not as good, but pretty good. So yeah, it's similar conditions to tomatoes in most respects.
You've given me a new lease on life. Eggplant is one of my very favorite foods in the whole world. I think it's one of the most beautiful foods. It's sort of bulbous and deep and purple, and just love it. Yeah. Me too. Wow. Okay, let's see. I'll circle back with you. You'll have to come back on the show, and I'll tell you in about a year if I was able to grow eggplant.
All right. And if you do like baba ganoush, I've got a fantastic recipe for you. So.
Okay. What do you put in yours? Cumin?
Yes. Lots of cumin.
Me too.
I'd have to actually look up the recipe to remember all the ingredients, because I'm not a great cook, but I loved that recipe. Oh, that is so cool. Well, thank you for that tidbit and all the knowledge drop that you have given us here today. If we've left anything with you folks, it's that regardless of your budget,
start thinking about market research as one of the tools that you cannot skip over. It's a natural step to every successful brand and product. So work it into your business plan. Even if you don't have the big budget to put behind it, at least put the intellectual capacity behind it. Have those wheels spinning in your head, put the time behind it, find whatever budget you can and an intern, and at least start getting it on the marketing plan as a budget line. And in time, your budgets will grow and you'll do more and more of it, but you can't skip over it. It's complex and competitive marketplace out there. So you'll want to have marketing in general and consumer research specifically from today's conversation in your wheelhouse. Shay, I want to thank you for being with me today. Thanks for all you do.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you, Elizabeth.
If anybody wants to find Shay, of course, you can go to moonshotcollaborative.com. There's probably a contact button there. Or should we hit you up on LinkedIn? What's the best way to find you?
Sure. Yep. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm active on LinkedIn, or che@moonshotcollaborative.com.
Okay. Che at moonshotcollaborative.com. Che, that's CHE at moonshotcollaborative.com. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. You can find me on LinkedIn. I always hang out there. You can go to elizabethalfano.com. Follow me anywhere on socials. Subscribe to this podcast, The Plant-Based Business Hour. I want to thank Che again for being with me and for everybody listening for all that you do. Thank you for moving the needle forward for people, the planet, and animals, because we are indeed taking back our health and the health of the planet. Thanks, everybody. Che, don't go away. Everybody else, I will see you next week. Bye, all.
Thank you.